Greetings, everybody. My name is Dmitry, and today I'd like to tell you a story, really, about how we created a family of composite foreign exchange feeds. And initially, it used to be like a small research project, and as such, it really is suboptimal in several ways. But later, it grown into a full-fledged marketable product. And although we don't claim that our approach is the best one, it still worked, So my hope is, ultimately that the presentation will be useful to at least some of you. And with that in mind, a fact that undoubtedly many of you are familiar with, and that is that currencies are typically traded over the counter. And I say typically here because there are some exceptions when currencies are indeed traded on centralized exchanges, but that's more of an exception than a rule. And as a consequence, each venue quotes their own prices. So at each point in time, there's no such a thing as the price or the official place of listing, like, for instance, you have stocks. And as an illustration, consider the currency rate for Euro USD coming from 14 different sources on the scale of days. And apart from, despite having different colors, the time series are very similar. Naturally, because otherwise that would have presented an arbitrage opportunity. But if I zoom in and we take a closer look, so now it's on the scale of minutes, tens of minutes, you see that the dynamics of individual feeds is quite different. For instance, volatility is different. Like if you compare source number 9 with the rest of the sources, the frequency is different. Some feeds have low frequency, some have higher frequencies, and so on. And I'm not sure if you can spot it, but feed number 6 is biased. That is, it's shifted compared with the rest of the feeds. And if I overlay the plots for you, you can see that, clearly it's a mess. And the dynamics is very different. And so one day you are, a guy from sales department comes to you and says, hey, listen, for a particular currency pair, can we have a single composite feed? Like the feed that would capture the global market value of the currency at every point in time. And the end users, well, we actually don't exactly know. And you may argue that this isn't the best technical task specification, and you'd be right. And after a couple of rounds of clarifications, the task may be stated as follows, and I'll read it for you. So given a set of over-the-counter foreign exchange source feeds for a particular currency pair, combine a subset of the feeds into a single composite feed so as to maximize its quality. We are not supposed to enrich the feed based on some non-existing or somehow implied events in the quote flow. The utilized model should be simple, fair, and predictable. And the quantities we're going to disseminate would be price, size for both sides, although later we decided not to disseminate the size, so that the consumers won't be able to actually trade it. And here I say, mention maximizing the quality of the composite feed. So what's quality really? I mean, it should really depend on the end users and their requirements. But since we don't know, we will have to improvise a bit. And to formalize the notion of quality, I suggest we introduce quality metrics. And here is a 60 seconds close-up, the same 13 feeds. and on a scale of seconds, right? So it's a mid price. And one thing that immediately comes to mind is that frequency is non-homogeneous. For instance, during the first 10 seconds, the frequency is very high. But then there are periods of complete inactivity. Like, for instance, there are periods when no feed was ticking for more than 3 seconds. They're highlighted in gray here. And really, frequency is a very desirable property because people who consume currency feeds, if there's no data, then that creates some sort of an uncertainty for them. And that makes them nervous, really. So we want our feed to tick frequently, but just frequent enough. So we formalize this intuition in the following metric. We fix a threshold called tau, which denotes the maximum allowed delay between the 2 subsequent events. And for instance, the tau may take values of, say, 2 seconds. And if the difference between the 2 events is greater than 2 seconds, then we record this difference. Otherwise, it's 0. And so the value of the metric is just sum of the differences of the excessive sort of silence periods, normalized by the total length of the time period. As a metric, it lies, due to normalization, it lies between 0 and 1. And the best value is 0, and the worst possible value is 1. That means a particular feed wasn't ticking at all. And to increase the feed quality, you would want to minimize this metric. Next up, I suggest we take a look at this 60-second close-up again. And we notice other characteristics of the feeds. For instance, volatility. Some feeds are more volatile than others. For instance, the pink feed here has high volatility compared to other feeds. And the purple feed here on the top is definitely shifted compared with other feeds. So we sort of like to measure bias and variance somehow. And looking back at it again, we could have assign some sort of an importance property to every feed and say, or rather to every tick, and say, if there was large transaction volume, then this particular tick gets high weight. Or for instance, if we trust some particular source a priori, then we say that it's more important compared to others. But the important thing is that we cannot say, just looking at the graphs of mid-price, that one particular feed is correct or right, and the other ones are wrong. So ideally, we'd like to have some sort of a reference feed to compare against. And here's a twist. Actually, there is such a reference feed. The company behind it has the following setup. So they have K market makers connected to electronic communication networks. They receive the corresponding number of bid-ask quotes for a minimum of 1 million in base currency. They also filter erroneous data like spikes. They take just the best bid and ask from each feed and compare the mid price using the best bid and ask 20 to 50 times per second using the best prices. Now, you may be right to think that actually the fee that we wanted to get in the first place. So why bother, creating another product? You'd be right. However, there are important limitations associated with the reference feed. And in particular, the company only disseminates the midpoint, but we would like to disseminate both bid and ask. The feed is licensed only for internal use, and quite frankly, it's a bit expensive. So we'd like to obtain a cheaper product. And for some currencies, it's not as frequent, and we would like to somehow increase the frequency of the composite feed. Here, just for reference, for your information, I overlay the mid price of reference feed over the source feeds. So speaking of the metric, to compare each source feed with the reference feed, we did the following way. We take the reference feed, and for each mid-price value, we find a corresponding mid-price for a particular source. And this is a technique called last observation carried forward. I'm sure you probably heard the term. And then we simply compute the root mean square error, which is the square root of the sum of squared differences between the mid-price of a source feed and the reference feed. So again, it's a metric that you want to minimize. The smaller the difference, the better. And the higher the difference, the worse, obviously. And the next metric is the spread, or another characteristic of currency feed is the spread. And it turns out it's actually also important because people tend to prefer tighter spreads. And here I plotted different spread values over the initial time period. So it's on the scale of days, and you can see that indeed the spread values are different. And if we examine the close-up, we can see that for some feeds, their values oscillate between just a couple of values, really. And indeed, we can verify the findings by plotting the number of distinct spread values for different sources. And for some, this value is 2, 3, and for some it's more than 300. In the end, we decide to say that the spread metric is simply the median of all the spread values. And again, people or consumers tend to prefer tighter spreads. So again, the lower the metric, the better. And to summarize, we've got three metrics: one for frequency, another one for reference feed distance, and the third one for the spread. Metrics that we would like to minimize. And once we say minimization or maximization, that means we're concerned with some sort of an optimization problem. If you have just one metric, then the optimization is trivial. It's just one-dimensional optimization. There's a ton of different methods and techniques. When you have three metrics to optimize, then you're stepping into the realm of multi-objective optimization. But first, I would like to formally specify the optimization problem. We do it this way. So we take a parametric model F and we parameterize it with a parameter vector W, which is a k-dimensional real vector. And then the goal is to find W star, which gives the best value of the function for all time steps. And to evaluate it, the procedure is very simple. So we will backtest our parametric model and obtain a very long vector. And we then evaluate the three metrics that I suggested earlier. So probably the right way to do it is, I'm going to skip it, is to work within the framework of modern portfolio theory-like optimization, if you will, where you have a particular manifold as a set of feasible solutions, and you then look for the set of optimal solutions, and then you somehow choose the optimal solution. But the problem here is not that simple, because that manifold of feasible solutions may not be as simple as the Markowitz bullet, the parabolic shape that you get in the case of modern portfolio theory. So it's really not clear how to do the optimization right away in this setup. So we've chosen another option, and we tried a different approach, which we call rank-based approach. And it also worked. So I think it's worth paying attention, worth understanding. And it's a 5-step procedure, and it goes as follows. So we compute the 3 metrics for all available source feeds. We then rank each feed by the computed metric, and then we sum the resulting ranks for each feed. And after that step, we can say that this source feed is better than the other feeds. This one is the second best, and so on. Then we iteratively choose the first best feed, the 2 best feeds, 3 best feeds, and so on. And we feed our model to the data and evaluate the score. And we do it for all k subsets. And in the end, we have k set of vector of k vectors of model parameters, from which we'll have to somehow choose the best parameter, accordingly, the best model. Speaking about the model, I think you'd agree that weighted average meets the requirements of being simple, fair, and predictable. And for the purpose of optimization, that's the function that we compute. So at each step, let's call it time step I, we have k different mid prices, one for each source. And then we compute our estimate as simply the weighted average for a particular value of parameter vector W. And to actually optimize the model, we have to find an objective function. And in our case, the objective function is the residual sum of squares. So suppose we have an estimate, and the ith residual is simply the difference of this estimate with the reference feed value. So the objective function is simply the squared sum of the residuals, which is the function of W, which we try to minimize. The weights, they are not just random k-dimensional vectors, rather they all lie within the truncated standard simplex. Namely, each parameter vector is a k-dimensional real vector, such that its L1 norm is 1, simply because these are weights. And each coordinate of the vector should be greater than 0 and less than 1. And for practical purposes, instead of having the requirement of each coordinate being greater than 0, we say that they should be greater than some small value alpha, because otherwise the optimizer may set the coordinates to 0, and we would like to keep all the components that we've chosen initially. And so you can see that the objective function is quadratic as a function of W. The constraints are linear. So the problem can be solved using a quadratic optimization technique, which is very important because there are some good techniques and good implementations, and the optimization works very fast in this case. But to do that, we have to transform the problem into a vector form. First of all, we say that we have the data matrix M, such that it's a matrix of mid prices. And so for rows, you have time steps, and for columns, you have different source feed values. Then our estimate for all time steps is simply this matrix product of the data matrix with the weight vector. Hence, we can rewrite the residual sum of square function the following way. So we do the substitution and we write the sum as the vector product. Then we substitute the expression for the estimate as the vector product of M and W. Then they expand the product, and then we rearrange a bit and obtain the expression at the very bottom. And again, this is the same expression, but notice that the third term doesn't contain any W, so it's irrelevant for optimization. And it turns out for purposes of feeding it to the optimizer, there's a standard way of rewriting the residual sum of squares, which turns out to be this way. And so it can be trivially rewritten in terms of matrix G and vector C. Now, the final step is to formalize the equality constraints. and inequality constraints. Namely, the quality constraint that the L1 norm should be equal to 1 can be expressed as a vector product of a vector of all ones and parameter vector W. So it should be equal to 1. Now, the inequality constraints, for instance, that the first coordinate, that's W1, should be greater than or equal to alpha, can also be expressed as a vector product of vector of 1 or zeros times W. And if you do the multiplication, you get the initial constraint. You do the same for the rest of the constraints, both all inequality constraints. And as a final step, like really final step, you simply rearrange the coordinates of the constraint vectors into one big matrix. So the first constraint goes here in the first row, the second is the second row, and so on. And the values of the constraints are arranged into matrix B. And that's it, really, because then all we have to do is to feed those values to a solver. And we used a solver from our package called Quant proc, which implements a method described in an article called Dual and Prime Dual Methods for Solving Strictly Convex Quadratic Programs. And I once used to know every intricate detail of the algorithm, but now I can't recall any, simply because it just works, you know. And so the optimizer gives you the desirable value. But if you're interested, you can always consult the reference. Oh, yes, and one, I guess, final point before we move on to the illustration is the outlier detection, because outliers can really skew your estimates and spoil your models. I'm certain you know that there are many ways to remove outliers, many methods and techniques. One we used was a semi-automatic technique of first fitting a natural supply model to the time series. And depending on the degrees of freedom of the model, you get different fits. And then as the second step, we computed what's known as the Cook's distance for every data point. And then we said the outliers are those points that lie outside of a particular quantile of the Cook's distance. So for instance, here you have 4 plots, and depending on the threshold, you get different data points marked as outliers. And the procedure is semi-automatic in the sense that an analyst still has to look at it and say, these value for degrees of freedom is good, and this particular value for the Cook's distance threshold gives a meaningful result. Right, but it's still better than finding the outliers manually. Right, now finally for illustration. 13 sources of Euro-USD currency rates and 1 week of data. Now, stage 1, as you may recall, is source feed ranking. We computed the 3 metrics, and when we ranked them and summed the ranks. And as you can see from the plot, source number 2 is the best in terms of all the 3 metrics. But it's not as good, for instance, as source number 6 in terms of the spread, but nevertheless, it's the best overall. Then what we do next, we select the first best feed, 2 best feeds, 4 best feeds. That means feed number 2, feed 2 and 4, 2, 4, and 6, and so on. And for each selection of feeds, we fit the model to the data. And the model, as you recall, is weighted at rich. And here you see a different weight balance of all the 13 possible models. And for instance, model number 3 has weights almost equally distributed among all the source feeds. Finally, we have to select the model that we think is appropriate, and that's the toughest part because it involves manual analysis, if you will. But first of all, the plot. On x-axis, you have the frequency metric. On y-axis, you have the reference feed distance metric, and every point size shows the spread metric. And as we add more and more feeds to the model, the frequency decreases. And so the frequency metric decreases. The spread increases, obviously, and the reference feed distance metric behaves differently. So first of all, it may decrease, but then as you start adding worse and worse feeds into the model, the metric may start to increase. And so in this case, the analyst should say, aha, there's always a compromise. And I'm satisfied with model number 8 because it has a sufficiently high frequency and it's sufficiently close to the reference feed, and its spread didn't degrade dramatically. So we choose model number 8. And finally, to sort of verify that the final model makes sense, we plot the metrics again of the composite model versus the constituent feeds. And so you can indeed see that the frequency is the highest. It's closest to the reference feed, and its spread is not the smallest, but I think it's still acceptable. This is the model of our choice. And I think that concludes the optimization procedure. Now, improvements. I can hear some of you screaming, what about out-of-sample evaluation? Well, as a matter of fact, we never formally performed sort of out-of-sample evaluation and never tested the result for stability in terms of how fast the weights degrade. But the only thing I can tell you, well, that's, by the way, due to budget limitations mainly. But the only thing I can tell you is that I was only getting positive feedback from my colleagues, and our clients never complained. You can also do proper multi-objective optimization, the Markowitz's modern portfolio theory style. You could try other metrics, the ones, for instance, feedback from users. So you may optimize characteristics that are important for the feed consumers. You could somehow optimize the outlier detection, and you could try other models, for instance, one based on the exponential weight decay, and so on. That concludes my talk. So thank you very much. You are encouraged to visit our site. And if you're interested in this or similar products, you can contact our solution delivery team. And meanwhile, I welcome you to ask any questions if you're interested. And I would also like to take my time and say a big thank you to the CKS staff, and in particular to Riaz and Paul and Sebastian, Stuart Jackerman, and Richard Diamond and the rest for giving me an opportunity to learn a ton of exciting stuff during the previous CQF program. And I can testify that indeed it was a remarkable intellectual journey. So thank you very much.